Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Oh,
yes,
we do.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, we
I kept pressing the lever for long time. We can go over anywhere. So how are you? Like, supposed to do work in Costa Rica at some point.
no, I'm I guess I'm time tuning. There's a lot of time. Fine.
Yeah, you have to, I think, coming up with the questionnaires. Hiring Vietnam.
In June in the wider.
Everybody they didn't look for. But they seemed interested.
Yeah.
We went to talk to
Yes, that's right. That's what I was
so things were moving. And then
was like 700 presented on Mexico.
Yeah.
I should try to scrape late LinkedIn. I bet most of them are going to be. They're all high skill. Not all. The ones that are. I don't have to go. Scrape it as in like. Yeah. I mean, get a list. Yeah. It would be like a very. It would be incomplete. It would be incomplete one with several dimensions, coverage of people, and then whether the history is lens exactly being updated. But it could be interesting. That's not bad to do in general. Yeah, because like within these industries, the titles actually mean something. So your VP, if I get that in a bank. How are you? Yeah. That's fine. I got it. I saw you as running over, and also when you can go try to go assess. How are you? Okay. Sure. The political route wasn't too. Oh, okay.
All the elections. Everyone's like their TV. But after we went to Florida, we're run late.
Why was it considered failure?
Like the dating service. Only men. I'm not sure. And you know what? I don't have
More Austria.
Trade.
I just got
Chris, is that the one?
Yeah.
Make sure you use the roving mic for questions and answers. That might be recorded. Do you want me to show you?
Chaired by Eric, right?
Yes, chaired by Eric and Andreas. The minister goes first. No, minister. The one standing next to Richard. And then the three other presenters. Is the chair here? Yes. I'm just reminding you, if you do have the here, do you know if you have a microphone?
This room is small. I think we need a microphone.
Okay, we just have to remind you that the classes and stuff like that, just so that when we record it, it makes it better.
So I don't understand. We want everyone to speak into the microphone.
Maybe I do. Just like maybe what the classes was, just for the purposes of recording.
So I won't be speaking. Yes, but
Oh, I see.
I'm not going to. That's awkward. I'm not going to. I'm not
necessary. Okay, that's fine. Okay.
If there is, I'll.
Okay.
Yeah, there's something like hashtag GrowthWeek Twitter account. If anyone wants to tweet,
Should I should mention that? Okay.
I would like if you could do that. It's not necessary.
So you could do that by email, but unfortunately, right, you wouldn't have to be in person. You have the instructor. The question is then, you kind of well information. How do you? I don't know. I have no idea.
Introduce the purpose, timing. That's the main point.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, good morning. Welcome. We're going to get started. This is the trade session. We're very happy to have, we're honored to have Mr. Francois Kanimba from Rwanda, who will be introducing the session, and then our three speakers will be in order on the program. It's Ahmed Kandawal, and then Nico Voigtlander, and Chris Woodruff. The session is on trade and productivity, although hopefully we'll also touch on broader topics. Without further ado, so we have a quite full session. We have three speakers. So I want to introduce Minister Kanimba, who was principal economist at the World Bank, and then was deputy governor and governor of the Central Bank of Rwanda, and since 2011 has been the Minister of Trade and Industry in Rwanda. My understanding also he's played a very important leadership role in the African Union in the Doha round of negotiations of the WTO, and so it's in formulating a position of the African Union in the Doha round. So without further ado, we're very honored to have Minister Kanimba. Please come up and introduce the session.
Do you want to be as short as an update? So thank you, everybody. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this program to give me the opportunity to provide introductory remarks to open this morning session in trade research. I'm delighted that we hear presentations from three of the leading lights in trade and farm productivity research. For my brief remarks, I would like to focus on the Rwandan perspective on trade and the farm level productivity growth, and what these abstract topics mean for other countries across Africa and the wide world. As we hear throughout today's sessions, productivity gains in export sectors have the potential to unlock benefits for millions of poor people around the world. We as policymakers, academics, and government officials must strive to put in place the right policy to obtain these goals. Rwanda as some of you might be aware, has experienced a very remarkable growth over the last 2 decades, with an average growth rate at about 8% per annum, in a very sustained manner. At the same time, all the macroeconomic indicators, including inflation, debt, have stabilized. At the same time, the country has been implementing a very ambitious reform agenda to improve the business environment. I'm sure you have been reading in global economic literature about the progress made by Rwanda in doing business reforms, where in a short period of around 7 years, Rwanda has been jumping from 158 land to currently 32, which is actually close to a miracle in terms of improving the business environment. In this process, we will see quite sustained growth in our exports, which have been able in the last 6 years to achieve an average growth rate of 20%. But at the same time, we have been observing a kind of diversification where new exports by small and medium enterprises in the manufacturing and agro-processing sectors actually are driving the exports in Rwanda. I'm very excited by today's session mornings because they have bearing on what you are seeing in Rwanda. I'm sure the key topics of research highlighting the linkages between productivity and export diversification are of great interest for Rwanda. Based on our growth experience in the last 2 decades, we have been encouraged and set a very ambitious growth agenda for the medium to longer term period. Now the government of Rwanda is really targeting to upgrade the country from elite developed country to a middle income status by the year 2020. And for this to happen, we will set very ambitious target in terms of growth. We are targeting a double-digit growth and a very high level of exports, which are set to grow at a minimum of 28% per annum. So these are quite very ambitious growth, but we strongly believe these are very achievable, and but we are at the same time convinced this will not happen over time. There is a need for combined efforts from what the International Growth Center is doing in terms of deep economic research to inform policy decision-making process to improve on the way we do business in the economic era. I may tell you actually you have already some very good example in our relationship working with the International Growth Center. Last year they conducted a deep analytical work on the East African Community Common External Tariff, which was set a few years back before Rwanda actually joined the community. And it seems this common external tariff in EAC definitely has negative effects on competitiveness of the Rwandan export sectors. And we are looking now to use this work to inform the Rwandan position when it comes to review the common external tariff next year. So this is a practical example of how our interactive work with the International Growth Center may be influencing our decision-making process in a very positive way. The other example actually was one of the research papers we discussed yesterday in the Rwanda session, where Rocco Chiavero highlighted market failures in a coffee washing station in Rwanda, leading to suboptimal outcomes for export revenues. This research paper will inform the design of new policies to address the weaknesses in the coffee industry and grow coffee exports values. This is an example where, once again, the academic research being conducted by the National Growth Center highlighting or focusing on key real issues is yielding results in terms of policy change. I'm confident today's speakers will also be focusing on the clear message coming out from the research and what this means for policymakers like me. So once again, I thank you for the opportunity and wish you a very productive debate.
Speaker is Amit Kendall from Columbia Business School. I forgot to mention earlier that if you were moved to tweet about this session, you can use the hashtag GrowthWeek.
Where is it?
No, okay. All right. So thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. I was asked to talk a bit about, to not discuss one particular paper, but to talk a bit about what the research has shown between the links between trade reforms and productivity have been. And as you can see from the title, I'll concentrate on giving examples from two different countries, China and India, and then perhaps we can use the discussion to think about whether these ideas and insights are applicable to other contexts. I think they are, but we can discuss that. So the motivation for thinking about this topic is a picture like the following, which basically is a picture between income per capita and total factor productivity. So as economists will tell you that if you take output in an economy, you can decompose that output into the amount of inputs that a country has, so land, labor, and capital, and how efficiently it uses those inputs. That's what we'll call total factor productivity. And when you do those decompositions, what you find is that the vast majority of output appears to be driven by differences in productivity across countries. And so one of the central tasks of economists across all disciplines, actually, is to try to understand why are some countries more productive or able to use their inputs more productively than others. And people who study international trade have long believed that there is a link between international trade and productivity. So here's one way to quantify that long history. So this is if you look at the fraction of books that Google has scanned, which is something like 5 million books, that have the phrase trade and productivity, you notice two things. So one is most books don't talk about trade and productivity. That's why it's very small. But of the books that do talk about trade and productivity, you do see an increase in this trend over time, which perhaps coincides with this period in which many countries, including China, are embarking on trade liberalizations and starting to open up their economies over time. So what I'll do today is talk a little bit about what we've learned. I only have a half an hour, so it's going to be only talking about a handful of ideas that have come out of the literature and why I think more research is needed and where. And just to set up the boundaries of this talk, this is obviously a very broad topic, and there's many kinds of policies one can consider that would improve the performance of the firms. Trade is by no means the only one. Credit constraints, tax policies, infrastructure, and so forth. Actually, to be honest, I'm not sure if you asked an economist which of these reforms would be the biggest bang for the buck. I don't think we have a very clear answer on. But so what I'll do in this talk is talk more narrowly on the removal of trade barriers, and then more narrowly only on a handful of mechanisms, and then again using examples. Okay. All right. So let's just jump into it. So how might reducing trade barriers actually improve the productivity of firms? So the predominant mechanism that's discussed in the academic literature today refers to a concept of a cross-firm mechanism through which resources are reallocated from low productive firms to more productive firms. The trade comes, it makes unproductive firms less likely to operate in the market, and then once those firms exit, resources are reallocated. This is a selection effect mechanism. I think Nico is going to talk a little bit more about that. But what I will say is that there is evidence of this channel. So in Chile's trade liberalization episode in the early 80s, for example, 2/3 of the aggregate gains in productivity came from the reallocation of resources from unproductive firms moving towards more productive firms. But this is by no means the only mechanism. And in fact, there are many other mechanisms that have since been documented that talk about, or that show very large gains from trade occurring through other channels. Right? So what I'll talk about is another kind of reallocation mechanism across firms, which I'll refer to as removing misallocation. So I'll show you, and I'll be more specific about what I mean by this. I'll show you that there's evidence of this in a particular liberalization episode from China. There's also been a more recent paper on Mozambique showing this as well. And there's many mechanisms that occur within the firm in which productivity improves. So there's this idea that competition from international trade reduces firm slack. There's access to larger markets. So there's evidence from Argentina, and again, Nico will talk about evidence from Chile. There's also access to sophisticated consumers. Okay, so this is particularly, we think, salient for developing countries, which is that international trade exposes them to buyers who are more demanding and will potentially transfer knowledge on how to make products either higher quality or lower, or with greater efficiency. And there's been evidence shown from this in Slovenia, for example. I'm doing some work in Egypt, which is suggesting that there's evidence coming out of that country, suggesting that channel is in fact going on as well. And then finally, a different channel, which is what I'll spend the latter half of this talk talking about, is access to intermediate inputs. Okay, and so there's now also an overwhelming, I don't know if overwhelming, but several examples from different countries at different levels of income per capita that suggest that having access to intermediate inputs from abroad is actually very beneficial for firms. Okay, and so I'll talk about some of the insights that we've learned from them. Okay, so let me first talk about this idea that trade reform can remove misallocation. Okay, so if you think about the basic setup that the literature will consider, is that they'll consider that an example in which firms have differences in productivity. So there's some productive firms here, and there's some unproductive firms here. And there are some operating costs that firms need to incur in order to operate in a market. And this will segment the economy, and firms who can pay this cost are going to be entrants, and firms that aren't are going to exit. And what international trade or opening up to international trade will do is it'll move this cutoff. And so then what you'll do is you'll get aggregate gains from productivity by truncating the left tail of the productivity distribution. Okay, so now what I want to consider a point of departure in which firms not only differ in terms of how productive they are, but also in something that I'll call connections or connectedness. Okay, and so anyone who's done business or talked to firms in developing countries, they will often hear that this thing often matters. So who you know and in your particular locality is particularly important for how successful your firm is. And so once you recognize that the success of a firm is not just in how efficiently it can produce a product, but also in other dimensions, then it's going to be the joint distribution of, for example, its productivity and how connected the firm is that matters for how successful the firm is. Right? And so there what you get is a situation in which you can have, for example, a very connected firm that is very unproductive, but that firm is able to obtain a license and operate in the market. And you can have very productive firms. You can have very productive firms here, for example, who don't have the political connections necessary, who are not able to. And this is a very clear case of misallocation. Right? We have a lot of resources that are going to the unproductive firm that happens to operate because they have political ties or ties to a particular sector. And then the new entrepreneur who has a very, very innovative idea who doesn't have those connections, who is shut out of the market. Okay, so let me give you an example in which trade can actually improve this reallocation, or improve this allocation of resources. Okay, so why might misallocation occur in a protected market? So institutions, whenever you have trade barriers, institutions have to be formed in order to manage those trade barriers. Okay, and those institutions may be subject to bureaucratic capture. So you can think about customs agents as having a lot of discretion to withhold goods in bonded warehouses, assess tariff duties, demand more paperwork, etc. And if that situation occurs, then we could have an episode in which institutions that manage the trade barriers may actually be favoring firms that can navigate the system, quote unquote the system, right, over firms that can simply produce more efficiently. And that can lead to situations where some countries, such as Angola, have outsourced the collection of their customs to NGOs for precisely this reason. So this was, in the case of Angola, customs collection was rife with corruption, and they basically turned it over to an NGO to basically take over this, right? So this is their idea of, their way of reforming an institution was essentially to outsource it in this case. Okay, so now let me show you a particular example coming from China, in which we can see misallocation occurring, and trade reforms removing that misallocation. So up until 2005, essentially every article of clothing that was exported from a developing country to the developed world was subject to a quota. So this is an example of a quota that existed in the United States on women's cotton shirts, and so the quota would give you the amount of T-shirts or shirts that could be sent from, say, China to the U.S. and you could not exceed that limit. There were products that were subject to quotas. So, for example, if China wanted to send men's cotton pajamas to the U.S., it would be subject to quotas, but the EU didn't impose quotas in place and hadn't done so for the past 50 years, and so men's cotton pajamas from China to the EU would not be subject to quota. But on January 1st, 2005, all the quotas were finally eliminated. Okay, so here's just a graph of China's exports in products that were subject to quotas, the quota-bound products, and products that were not subject to quotas up until 2005. You can see that they're trending fairly similarly. And then immediately when the quotas were rolled off, you see this big surge in exports from products that were previously under quotas. Okay? And this, of course, is not surprising. You had capped the limit, and then you remove the cap, and you see a big surge. All right. Okay, so now let's think a little bit about how the Chinese government allocated the licenses to exporters in order to export under that quota regime. And the details of that allocation, which may not strike you as surprising, are very murky as we tried to learn about them. And so now we can think about two different ways that the government could have allocated. So they could have allocated the licenses via an auction. So this is actually what they had done in Hong Kong, is that they set up a market and had trading rights on the licenses, and the most efficient firms would then bid for those quotas. And once you removed once you had trade reform and you removed all quotas, you would see the most efficient firms expand their exports. Okay, so you would see this growth in exports coming from the existing set of exporters who happen to be very efficient. Right. And so then, in that case, trade reforms are removing the sort of standard deadweight loss triangles that were associated, that we're familiar with when thinking about what a tariff or a tax does. Okay, that is different from allocating the quotas via, say, connections. Right? In this case, you can have potentially inefficient firms receiving quotas, and then when you remove the quotas, then what you should expect is that a lot of the growth should be coming from not the incumbent exporters, but new entrants who should look more productive than the existing firms. All right, and so by decomposing the source of where this growth is coming from, can tell you something about how the allocation mechanism actually occurred, even though we don't actually know the precise rules behind that. All right, and so there, what you're getting is that trade reform dismantles the inefficient institution and allows efficient entrants to replace inefficient incumbents. All right, and so here's sort of what the data say. It's actually very clear in the Chinese case. So in China, it turns out there's a very easy proxy to understand which firms are inefficient, and it's the state-owned enterprises. So in the textile industry, state-owned enterprises have about 1/3 the productivity of a private sector firm. So they're substantially less efficient. So that's basically saying that they have massive amounts of capital, but they use that capital really inefficiently. Okay, and so if you look at the products that were never subject to quotas, you do see a decline in the role of the state, and that's just year on year. So this is the market share of SOEs. It falls 8% in 1 year. This is a general trend in the Chinese economy. So people who are familiar with China know that the role of the state has been declining and has been declining steadily over time. And so you see that picked up here. But now if you compare that to the set of products that were subject to quotas and then were rolled off the quotas, you see a much larger drop in the role of the state. And in fact, if you look at 2004, more than half of the exports in quota-bounded products were controlled by the state sector. And then once the quotas are removed, these numbers are actually very similar. Okay. And then when you start to decompose the sources of those, of how those reallocations, decompose how the reallocation is occurring, you see it's precisely the inefficient state-owned firms that are transferring resources to the productive firms who are entering into private lines. And this reform, crude back-of-the-envelope calculation will say that TFP in this sector increased by 14% simply through reallocation. And that it's a 14% gain in productivity is a very large gain, particularly in 1 year. And this is just coming from kicking out inefficient firms who are operating in the market and replacing them with more efficient firms. Okay, so it's also helpful to visualize how this might work. Okay, so that's sort of what the data tell you, and you can put a little bit more structure and try to quantify how important the relative contribution is of the direct removal of the trade barrier versus the dismantling of the inefficient institution. Okay, so let's imagine we can simulate some firms. So these are some productive firms, and these are some unproductive firms. And we allocate market shares according to an auction. And so you're going to get the more productive firms bidding for more quota, and they're going to have higher market shares. Okay, so these are more productive firms. They've got higher market share than the less productive firms. And then when you liberalize the economy, you're going to see a growth, particularly in the incumbent efficient exporters, and their exports are going to expand. Okay, and so this is what I'm going to claim is not actually occurring. And so we can compare that to a situation where firms have two sources of heterogeneity, just their same productivity, but now they also receive market share depending on how politically connected they are. If the political connections coincide exactly with productivity, then the auction allocation would mimic the quote unquote political allocation. And then you can start to break that correlation. Okay, so a correlation of 1 would give you an overlapping figure here. And now you can start to break the correlation. And so what is this? This is saying that when there's an imperfect correlation between how politically connected a firm is and their underlying productivity, you can have, for example, an inefficient firm like a state-owned enterprise that has very high market share. Okay? And then what we can do is we can match this simulation and we can compare where the source of the growth is coming from. Is it coming from intensive market firms that are existing exporters, or coming from firms that are new exporters, to what the actual data show. And it's not until you get down to a correlation that's actually quite low, which seems to match the data, which is basically saying that this is a market in which there are many inefficient firms who have received allocations, probably not because they were very productive. Okay. Now, we could read that result in two ways. Another way to see it is that the Chinese did not do this, right? So it wasn't the case that they were handing the quotas to the worst and least productive firms in the market, but it was nowhere close to being a strong positive correlation. Okay, and so when you run that decomposition, what you actually find in this situation is that most of the gains from trade can come simply from removing that misallocating institutions. Or another way to say this is that there didn't actually have to be a trade reform in order for China to actually improve the productivity of its sector. But what is the trade reform doing? Well, I think what it's doing in this case is it's making, it's reforming an institution that is actually quite difficult to do politically. And the WTO commitments that China had signed is an example where it ties the hands of a politician, and they can go to the state sector and say, we've signed up to these agreements, and so we have to abide by them. Right? And so this is an example where an externally mandated reform appears to deliver very large efficiency gains. Okay. How much time do I have?
12.
12 minutes. Perfect. Okay. So that's sort of one example in which you see an improvement in aggregate productivity as a result of trade reforms. That's coming through reallocating market shares across firms. And now I'm going to turn to a different mechanism, which is, again, up until recently I think was underemphasized, which is access to intermediate inputs. Okay, so if you look at, and I'll illustrate this in the case of India. Okay, so policymakers, so this is Rakesh Mohan, who's the former deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So he believed that one of the big benefits of the Indian reform was that it precisely provided access for Indian companies to source the best available inputs at much lower prices. And how does one actually try to go about studying this? So this is something that Nico is going to discuss more in detail. A typical study that tries to assess how the impact of trade or other types of policies on productivity will typically be done in a two-step procedure. So in the first step, you're going to try to extract a measure of productivity. A measure of productivity is essentially like a residual comparing revenues to expenditures. And then it takes that residual and then correlates that with changes in trade policy. And we can think about two different kinds of trade policies. One is the reduction in tariffs on final goods, so what I'll call output tariffs, and then the reduction of tariffs on intermediate goods, which we'll call input tariffs. Okay, and every trade reform is going to have both a reduction in final goods, but it's also going to mean that there's a reduction in tariffs on the intermediates that's used by a particular firm as well. So when people have looked at how productivity changes with these two measures of trade policies, in a number of studies now, you actually see that the magnitude of the response of productivity to input tariff reductions is actually quite large. And it's in the case of Indonesia, Hungary, India, and China, it appears to be larger than the magnitude that comes from the removal of output tariffs. Okay, so for example, in the case of Indonesia, a 10 percentage point decline in input tariffs raised productivity by 12%. And that magnitude is twice as large as output tariff reductions. And we find something similar in the case of India as well, and as well as China. Yep. Yeah.
Talk about markups and how much.
I will allude to that. I'm going to leave that discussion more to him. Yeah. So, so Eric does raise a question, which is the next slide, which is how does one interpret these sets of results? As I just mentioned, when people run a study like this, they're basically comparing revenues and costs and looking at that differential over time. And embedded in that is a residual, and to be honest, it captures many factors and many things, including how markups change. It captures how prices are changing. It's capturing how quality changes, and so forth. And so this is a nice point of departure, which is that now what we're getting is, in some sense, a measure of productivity is almost like a measure of our ignorance. And we're now seeing more and more studies that are starting to open up this black box. And they're opening up this black box in two ways. So one is to try to sort of quote-unquote obtain a cleaner measure of productivity using quantity information. So this is something, again, that I'll leave for Nico to discuss in more detail, since I think he's going to talk about that. The other thing, which is an area which I think is quite exciting, is we're now seeing many more papers across many different kinds of countries that are looking at more specific outcomes other than productivity to understand how those adjust to trade. Okay, so we're seeing investments in process versus product R&D. There's two very different things. One type of investment will lower costs. Another type of investment will change potentially the quality or the specifications of products. Different aspects of the labor composition of workforce and how the gains are being distributed amongst those workers, which I think is a very exciting area of work. I put productivity and quality here. This is trying to get more direct measures of productivity and quality, either through using, so things that Eric has done, using what we think are better proxies. For example, certifications that firms might need to take in order to, it's like ISO 9000 certifications, or in some work that we're also currently doing, or that I'm also currently doing, trying to get more direct measures of productivity simply through better survey collection. Okay, so So I think that will help also shed light on what precisely is happening inside the firm, as well as prices and markups. Okay. And so to give you a sense of how this kind of nuance is helpful, I'll go back to trying to understand the results, at least in India, on intermediate inputs. Okay, and so as I said, intermediate inputs appear to deliver this large gain in this measure of productivity. And so what exactly is going on there? Well, it turns out that economists have long stressed that an important aspect of growth is, in fact, going to come from access to new varieties. There's sort of a chain of events that can happen. So, for example, you can have tariff liberalization on inputs that generates demand for new varieties of inputs from the firms, and that stimulates the expansion into new product lines. So you can imagine the firms have fixed costs to import, and when you lower input tariffs, that enables firms to source more input varieties. And if you look at the Indian case, this seems to be what's going on. So when you look at the trade liberalization during the 90s from India, you see a big growth in imports. This is overall products. But if you just look at, for example, intermediate products, you see a much larger growth rate on intermediates. And then when you start to look at what's fueling that growth rate, you can decompose that. Is it coming from existing varieties that the Indian firms are demanding more of, or is it coming from new varieties that they're demanding? And it turns out that in intermediate products, virtually all of the growth in intermediates is coming from new varieties that are actually being predominantly sourced from richer OECD countries. Okay, so this is telling us something, right? It's still crude here, but it's still telling us something that what the Indian reform was really about was not so much that there was this big increase in competitive pressures. That may be going on, but a big effect was that they were given access to intermediates and new types of intermediate products. And then when you start to correlate those input tariffs reductions to what the firms are actually doing, you see a very strong correlation between input tariff reduction and expansion into new product lines by these firms. So of the total product scope expansion during this period in India, we think that our numbers suggest something like a third of that growth can come from input tariffs alone. And then if you add a little bit more structure, there's sort of two reasons for why lower input tariffs might be driving this result. So either the input price index is falling because lower input tariffs makes existing products cheaper, or it gives firms access to new varieties. And as I showed you, the headline figures suggest that varieties is an important channel. And then when we add a little bit more structure to this problem, we can in fact confirm that the product scope is actually very responsive to new input varieties and not just cheaper inputs. Okay. So given the time, I won't talk about how firms finance the introduction of new products. The short answer appears to be that there's an increase in markups, and so profit levels of the firms actually rises, but given the time, I won't have a chance to talk about that. But it does show, again, that there is an important role of intermediates as opposed to final goods in the case of India. I'll skip this quote. It's a quote from 1970 in which a chairman of a company in India is actually precisely complaining that he has the ability to make these products, but he just can't get the raw materials in order to jump into new product lines. Okay, so I'll conclude there. So I think my view on this work is that the results seem very, very strong in favor of in many developing countries that large-scale reforms have actually delivered improvements in the performance of industrial firms. There's two active areas of research that are trying to narrow that statement. One is through getting better measures of productivity, and the other is through accessing new types of data or designing survey collections to open up this TFP block. And so I think those are very active areas, and things that perhaps will come up in the discussion that I think are important, but things that I haven't talked on, and people have been working on in this room, is thinking a little bit more about when resources do actually reallocate to firms, how severe are those adjustment costs to workers, and then who are essentially the winners and losers as a result of these productivity gains. Okay, thanks.
So we can take, let's collect maybe 2 comments, and then we'll give Ahmed a chance to respond. Yes, here.
Was there any role of subsidies by the government after the quotas were eliminated in China?
So from what everything I know about the episode, there was no role of subsidies, and if anything, remember that the state sector is far more heavily subsidized, particularly on the credit side, and so we don't think that subsidies they may be changing overall, but what we were doing in that exercise is doing something that's very local. So we're comparing different kinds of textile products for which we don't think the subsidies would have been changing differentially. But subsidies in general, that's actually been a critique of what has happened post-crisis in China, which is that the subsidies have actually become even larger for the state sector. And so that those trends, if you look at aggregate importance of the state sector in China, it was falling basically up until 2007, and now it's petered, and if anything, has gone.
Okay, let's defer to the minister, and then Sam, and then Richard.
Yeah, thank you. Our question based on this research paper. On the African continent, we are now seeing a tendency where in different regional economic groupings, we are establishing free trade area where we removed internal tariffs within the trade area, but at the same time, setting quite significantly higher external tariff. And even for some products, we put very high protection. And what do you think about such policies based on this research paper? Do you think, are they good? Are they bad? What kind of change do you recommend?
So it's always put on spot to make strong statements. So I think.
Can I just jump in
Sure.
on this question
Yeah.
as well, because I think this is very interesting.
Yeah.
There's a two-handed intervention here, which is
Right.
the subtlety of the sequencing of tariff reductions,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, your emphasis on intermediate goods. Do
Exactly.
you lower tariffs on intermediate
Right.
goods while maintaining final goods high, and of course, the implications for effective rate of protection?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there has been a lot of, I think there's been some discussion in the academic literature about sequencing reforms and escalating tariffs, as you suggest. I am actually not aware of academic studies that have looked at this in sort of using microeconomic data in which you expand the market but maintain, but you don't expand the market so large. And so it's like a partial reform, in some sense it's a partial liberalization. Of course, you'd have to know a lot more about the structure of the tariffs. So, for example, are those high tariffs on intermediates or not? So I think one of the benefits that comes from the Indian example is the access to intermediates and the potential role for duty drawbacks, for example, or especially the economic zones that could stimulate growth while maintaining, as you said, kind of a seal on final good production.
Do you want to speak to this point?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment that back in the early 80s, Chile was one of the first countries to go into deep reduction in tariffs. And it was also one of the first countries where we started to get census level data to look at the effects of Jim Bible and others. And I think that the Chilean case might be, if not more relevant, at least as relevant as the Chinese and Indian case for African countries. At that time, Chile in 1980, 80% of what it exported was copper, so manufacturing was extremely small. And all these effects that were starting to be measured also at the firm level were capturing both the pro-competitive effect, the exit, and the effect that you were mentioning there. And those, I think, we could add as a historical example that would be pertinent for some African countries. I don't know about Rwanda, but there are quite a few African countries where the manufacturing sector is extremely small, perhaps similar to what it was in Chile.
Yeah, that's a very good comment.
Those days.
Yeah.
One more.
Yes, I follow up on that. Before regular liberalization of prices, do you find things in your governments were doing in terms of public investment or support mechanisms to enable them to be able to remove tariffs without damaging maybe a lesson for less than developing countries in Africa. What
Yeah.
else do you do in order to prepare ground for reforms?
Yeah, so what I can add on this is that if you look within India, for example, so within India is actually a very nice case in which you have very different business environments across states. And there, it does seem to be that post-reform, you start to see a divergence in the performance of states until kind of very recently, actually. And so that suggests that there are kind of additional reforms that might need to accompany trade reforms in order to deliver potentially larger bang for the buck. I would agree with that. What those precise set of reforms would be, I think, is still up for debate.
All right, thanks very much, Amit. Let's have next speaker, Nico Hoylander from UCLA Anderson School of Business.
Okay, thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. Thanks to Amit for doing most of the heavy lifting on introducing the productivity issue, so half of my work is done. Before I get started, let me do a bit of advertising. This paper is joined with an excellent grad student, Alvaro Garcia Marin, who's going to be on the job market this year, so watch out for him, for those of you in academia. Also for those of you in policymaking or higher economists. All right, so if you ask, just to recap a bit of what Amit already said, if you ask economists how countries can gain from international trade, they're going to start talking about efficiency. And they're for sure going to mention this first channel here. This one always jumps too far. No, okay, no, never mind. So they're always going to talk about this first channel, which is reallocation. And Amit already mentioned it. So essentially, what happens is if you open up for trade, you increase effective market size, and that allows firms that are already more productive to start with to grow. And it also increases competitive pressure on firms in the economy, and therefore less productive firms will shrink or even go out of the market. So what happens in the broad picture is that you reallocate resources to the most productive firms, and therefore your economy overall becomes more productive. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that confirms this first channel of reallocation. And then you ask more, so how else could countries gain from trade? And then economists will say, well, potentially there's another story, which is that efficiency gains could potentially also occur within export entrants. So if you open up for trade, now firms can enter the export market, and then maybe these firms become more efficient as well, because they now start exporting, maybe they invest in better technology. Problem here is that there's much weaker evidence. So you have probably close to 100 studies who use these country panels and try to identify these within firm productivity gains, and very few studies actually find these gains. Okay? So somehow we seem to be in a world where there's very strong evidence for these allocation gains across firms, reallocation, but firms that start out relatively unproductively, for these firms, trade globalization seems to be bad news, because we have very little evidence on within-firm efficiency gains. So in a nutshell, it looks as if unproductive firms don't become much better when the country opens up for trade. And this is, of course, bad news. They just get kicked out of the market, or they shrink. So is this really what we should believe? Well, if you ask people who study this more at the micro level, if you look at management studies, then there's actually a lot of evidence that suggests that firms do become better after export entry. Okay? So exporters face tougher competition and larger markets, so there's a strong incentive to invest in new technology. Paula Bustos has this very nice paper where she shows that these Argentinian firms who are more, who get more access to export markets, they invest in modern technology. Or then these management case studies where you talk to managers, and these plant managers say, when we started exporting or when we exported more, we became more exposed to international markets, we got more know-how, we had to impose quality standards, so we became more productive. So then there's this discrepancy between what you see at the micro level and what you observe in systematic country panels. Okay, so it looks as if you talk to firms, they say we gain from trade. If you look at the data in larger panels, you don't find anything. So this paper is all about resolving this contrast. And the resolution that we propose here is to look a bit closer at how economists think about efficiency. Okay, so let me spend one slide on a bit of technicalities on how economists typically measure efficiency. So when we talk about production, as economists. What we have in mind is that you produce physical output, Y, okay, so this is units of output, like number of cars, number of tables, number of chairs. And what you use is a production function, which is like a production recipe, by which you combine capital, labor, intermediate inputs in order to produce your final output. And then this parameter A is efficiency. So A tells you how efficient are you in putting together all these individual inputs and organizing your workforce and so on. Okay. So ideally you would measure this A out of a quantity production function. But of course what you typically observe is not number of cars produced in the data, but what you observe is the total value of car sales. Okay? So what you observe is product revenue, P times Y, rather than physical units of Y. Okay? And then this also means that what you will typically observe in the data is P times A. Okay? So just take this production function, multiply both sides by the price, and what you get is revenue equals, and then you have a revenue production function. This means that what you're really going to observe in the data is this P times A. Okay? So P times A is revenue productivity. And then you see immediately that this is not only the true efficiency, but it's also polluted by the price. And then a way to see how this could introduce a bias is just look at, again, revenue productivity is price times actual efficiency. So suppose that firms that are particularly efficient actually charge lower prices to their customers. And what's going to happen is that you have firms with a high A, but a relatively low price. So the most productive firms charging lower prices are actually going to look as if they're relatively unproductive when you look at their revenue productivity. And there's quite a bit of evidence, for example, if you look within new market entrants in the US, you see that, well, I should say one more thing, it's quite tricky to measure this A. So for some subsets of industries, you can get to what this true A is. Say you look at concrete producers, that's relatively straightforward to back out this quantity productivity, because they all just produce the very same thing, which is concrete. Okay? So you look at concrete producers, you know they're true A, and you look at new concrete production entries, or new entrant firms to concrete production. They're typically more efficient by this measure A. But they also charge lower prices because they don't have their customer base yet. So they need to attract customers, and what they do is they charge low prices in order to get new customers. So despite the fact that these new firms are very productive, or very efficient, they look relatively unproductive in terms of revenue productivity. And the question we ask in this paper is whether this same bias could also affect our results when we look at efficiency gains of export entrants. Okay, so could it be that new firms that enter the export markets actually do become more efficient, we just don't see these gains because they also charge lower prices in order to attract their new customers in the international market, right? And then the challenge, of course, is that you want a measure that is not affected by this price bias. And as I said, this is quite challenging because you can calculate this true A for a subset of industry that produce very homogeneous products, such as concrete or paper or cardboard boxes, but beyond this, it's pretty challenging to find a measure that's comparable across products. And so what we propose here is we propose to use marginal cost of production. How do we do this? Well, first of all, marginal cost is not affected by this price bias, and we can then focus on marginal cost trends within plants and look at what happens to marginal cost of production around the time of export entry, or around the time when you export more because of trade liberalization. Okay? We're going to use detailed Chilean data. Someone suggested already that Chile is a good case to look at. We have an excellent data set for Chile. And what's also nice is that for this very same data set, previous studies have found no effect of efficiency gains within firms after export entry. Okay, so we basically take a data set where previously people have said, well, these Chilean firms don't seem to become more efficient after export entry, and then we redo the analysis with our proposed better measure, which is marginal cost. And we're going to examine export entry and also export expansions. So here's what we find. Preview of the main results. We find very strong evidence for within plant efficiency gains after export entry in the range of 15 to 25%. We also find that most of these gains are actually passed on to customers in the form of lower prices. Again, in other words, these Chilean export entrants, they do become more efficient, but they also charge lower prices. So you just don't see these gains if you look at revenue productivity, P times A. And indeed, we see that revenue productivity is relatively flat around export entry. Okay. We look at the most likely drivers of these gains, and we find that typically export entry, but also export expansions, go hand in hand with investment in capital. Okay. So it looks as if there's a complementarity between having access to a larger market and investing in new technology in order to serve this larger market, and then this technology investment goes hand in hand with efficiency increases. So this is very much in line with what previous papers like this Paula Bustos papers have found. What's the main policy implication? I'm going to talk towards the end a little more about policy implications. So here, one main message is that you want to combine trade liberalization with the incentives to invest in new technology, because this is how you get these initially unproductive firms. If you incentivize them to invest in new technology, they become productive in the international market. All right. Okay, so one technical slide, but I don't want to bore you with math or anything. So it's just so you have a rough, intuitive idea of what we're doing here. How do you compute marginal costs? You can't just read them off the data. And what you can do is you can, as Amit said before, you can estimate a production function, which is quite technical. In the end, you get an idea about this firm's production recipe, basically. And then from this production function, there's a methodology that has just recently been invented, which you can use to calculate markups. You basically know how high, at the product level, how high is the markups that these firms are charging. And then when you know markups, so markups here is mu, you observe product prices in the data. That's why these Chilean data are so nice, because they allow us to observe product prices for each individual product that the firm produces. So you observe price in the data, you compute the markup, you calculate marginal costs. Okay? Now, of course, you could say, oh, this is all just very fancy. I just don't believe it. There's too much math behind all this. Okay? Now, there's another advantage in these Chilean data, which is that firms are actually asked to report their average cost of production, okay? Excluding any fixed costs. So this is like average variable cost of production. So we can look at the correlation between average variable cost that is reported and the marginal cost that we compute, and it looks very highly correlated. So this methodology that we use is not just focus, but it gives us something, something meaningful. Okay? All right. So once we have marginal costs, what do? We do this for the whole panel of Chilean plants. Unfortunately, we have to start in 1996. We cannot go to this main period of trade liberalization, which was before 96, but the data at the product level just don't exist before that year. So we started in 1996. We have data until 2005. We have about 5,000 plants. About 20% of these are exporters. And overall, this sample looks just very standard. So let me just show you that this is what we talk about when we talk about gains in the cross-section. So exporters are larger, they have more workers, they have more sales, they are more productive in terms of this revenue productivity, they pay higher wages and have higher markups. So this is all this typical thing that people look at, which is reallocation. Okay? So exporters in the cross-section are more productive, larger, and so on. The big question in this paper is, do exporters also become more productive after export entry? That's what we're going to look at next. Okay? So this doesn't tell us anything about what happens within exporting plants after they enter the export market. So that's where we're going to now. Okay? And we're going to start by looking at export entry. So this is basically the first part of the paper in just two graphs. On the left-hand side, we have revenue productivity, and so actually, I think it might be the older version of the presentation because there's something missing. But if we get to a point where I really need the newer version, I'll let you know. Okay? All right. So we have revenue productivity, which is what I told you before, which is basically price times true efficiency. And you see that around the period of export entry, so 0 years export entry, -1 means for this plant product 1 year before export entry, -2, 2 years before, and so on. So there's no action in revenue productivity. This just confirms exactly what previous studies have found. Now, if instead you look at marginal cost in this right panel, you see that as the firms enter the export market, marginal costs drop. Okay, so it's strong evidence for efficiency gains captured by marginal cost. You also see that at the same time, prices, which are these blue crosses, prices also drop. And we've seen before that if you become more efficient but you drop your prices, there's no action in revenue productivity. Okay, so Dropping marginal cost, but also dropping prices, means that you don't see any action in revenue productivity, despite the fact that there are important efficiency gains. Right? And another way to look at this is, of course, this relates to Eric's first question much earlier on during Amit's talk. So what is actually happening to markups? Well, here for export entrants, there's not much action in markups. Right? So markups rise a little bit as exporters become established, but there's relatively little evidence on this. And in fact, you would only see strong increases in revenue productivity if there was a big increase in markups. But that's not the case here. So in a nutshell, firms do seem to become more efficient, but they pass on these efficiency gains to their customers. So you don't observe these gains if you look at the wrong productivity measure. All right. So next we look at what could explain these efficiency gains. So one prominent dimension here. So I think now I really need the updated talk, which is.
I don't think it got saved.
Did you save it or not?
Tried, but I don't think it got.
Do you want the pen drive again? Okay, but, sorry. So in the data, we look at whether there is evidence that around the time of export entry, there's more investment, and indeed we find this. So we have detailed investment data for these Chilean plants, and we see that about a year before export entry, there's an increase in investment, and in particular in investment in capital equipment. Okay, let's see. Yeah, that's where I want to be. Okay. So if you look at investment data, you see indeed that export entry is associated with investment in new technology, in particular in capital investment. Another check that you can do is you can look at which are the plants that become particularly more efficient after export entry. It's a check that has been suggested in a paper by Lileva and Trepler. And essentially what we find there is that plants that are initially relatively unproductive, those are the ones that see the largest gains in efficiency after export entry. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you imagine that you're very unproductive initially, then you open up for trade. So to be able to export, you really need to see a large hike in your efficiency. And that's exactly what happens. So you see that firms that are initially relatively unproductive, and they do become exporters, they see huge efficiency increases. Okay. All right, so some further results. We then relate export entry to tariff changes. So there wasn't really a lot of action, but there's some industry-specific tariff declines that we can exploit over this time horizon. And we find that tariff declines, they decline on average by only 5.5%. So this is not a period of major trade liberalization, but yet you see substantial gains. Okay? So tariffs drop on average by 5.5 percentage points for manufacturing between 1996 and 2005. And this explains a decline in marginal cost for an average export entrant by about 13%. All right. So then next we do a whole bunch of robustness checks, but I don't want to get into that much detail. And then instead, let's focus on export expansions of firms that are already exporters. And then you lower your tariffs, so existing exporters export more. Okay, so what we looked at so far is new firms entering the export market, the extensive margin. Now we look at the intensive margin, firms exporting more. I said this before, so we exploit tariff changes across industries just to give you an idea of this magnitude. So you see that this is the development of export tariffs for the different Chilean industries, and you see that, for example, metallic products already start with relatively low export tariffs, and it doesn't decline by much. But then you have other sectors such as clothes and footwear, which see more substantial declines over time. And this kind of cross-industry variation is what we exploit here. All right. So what we find is that we see strong evidence for export expansions due to lower tariffs. And we also see that these export expansions are associated with gains in efficiency. If you look at marginal costs drop by about 10% because of the 5.5% decline in export tariffs. Right? So this is if you look at marginal costs. Then again, we compare this with the typical measure of revenue productivity. And here you see again that revenue productivity will underestimate these true efficiency gains. So if you look at revenue productivity, it goes up by about 4%. So this means that most of the previous studies that looked at the effect of trade on efficiency, and Amit had a whole slide on this, and I presume that these all used revenue productivity. So all of these measures, when you apply them, or all of these previous papers, when you apply their methodology to our sample, they would substantially underestimate the true gains from trade. Right? Because they look at revenue productivity, so they would have identified 4% efficiency gains because of these tariff declines in Chile over this 10-year period. If you look at marginal costs, which is not affected by this price bias that I talked about initially, you see much larger efficiency gains. So this suggests, of course, that we should go back and where data are available, we should recheck again for the magnitude of these gains from trade. And we would expect that we would find substantially larger gains once we take into account this price bias. One more thing is, how much time do I have? 10? Oh, yeah. So if what I did just on the previous slide is I exploited this variation in export tariffs in order to predict export expansions. Right? The other thing you can imagine you can do is you look at periods when there are no changes in export tariffs and see is there a relationship between efficiency and exporting more. So suppose there's no change in tariff, but a firm gets a demand shock because consumers abroad like its product more, but just for a year or two. Right? So you will get some fluctuations in export volume. And interestingly, there you see no association between efficiency and exporting more. So in the absence of permanent tariff declines, this is our interpretation, firms simply don't have an incentive to invest in technology. If you get a one-time demand shock and you anticipate it's not going to last forever, you're not going to invest in the capacity to produce more for the export market for the next couple of years. So this gives rise to another important policy implication, which is that you want to provide a certainty environment for firms where they can anticipate my export tariffs are low for basically permanently, and then you incentivize investment. If firms just get short-term, temporary demand shocks, it won't incentivize them to invest in new technology. Okay, so to conclude, what we find is that contrary to most of the previous literature, we find that within plant efficiency gains after export entry are actually substantial. And this revises the previously weak evidence. And in fact, we show that if we use the very same measure that previous studies have used, we don't find any evidence either for within plant efficiency gains. But once we get rid of the price bias and look at marginal costs, we find strong indication for within plant efficiency gains. Then this resolves this previous puzzle that when you talk to managers, they will tell you, we increased our efficiency after starting to export or after exporting more. And the other side of the evidence, which was more systematic panel evidence, just didn't find this evidence. Okay? So we resolved this puzzling contrast. And we also show that a substantial part of these efficiency gains are passed on to customers. And this pass-through to customers is particularly strong for export entrants. It's a bit weaker for expansions of existing exporters. So you remember in the case of existing exporters, about 1/2 of the efficiency gains actually showed up in revenue productivity. So this means that if you have new exporters, our interpretation is if you have a new export entrant, there's a strong incentive to pass on efficiency gains in order to attract new customers. But if you're already an established customer, an established exporter, this incentive or this pressure to charge lower prices is a bit weaker. So you will see some of the gains in revenue productivity. Policy implications. So first, unproductive firms, trade is not necessarily bad news for these. Right? So unproductive firms can actually become more efficient as your country opens up for trade. But of course, you want to provide an environment where ideally you combine trade liberalization with incentives to invest in modern technology. And this would be the ideal setup. And on top of this, an environment where you provide certainty for these firms. So you want them to know that they're going to have access to the export market in a stable fashion. You're not just going to go back to where you were before in a couple of years. And you want them to have certainty about the environment in which they invest in this modern technology. All right.
So both speakers are going to be complimentary for sticking to the time. The for some comments or questions. Over here, and then under
It's combining the first presentation with this presentation. For the existing unproductive farms, they always fear that it's not really getting into the export market, but it is opening up to imports from more productive farms that might actually reduce their market share or might actually result in the reallocation that the first presenter was talking about. How do you include that in the policy implication? Because if we don't, they are the ones that will capture trade reform. I mean, they become a political body and either slow down or reject the trade liberalization.
Yeah. So there are different productivity cutoffs. Right? One cutoff is are you productive enough to enter the export market? Another one is, are you so unproductive that you're going to be completely kicked out of the market by this import competition? So I have not looked into this in detail, but I would guess that our results apply more to the firms that are in between these two thresholds. So if you are a firm that is at the verge of being able to export, and then you get a period of trade liberalization, that might just be enough to say, okay, now it's worthwhile doing this investment. So you were just below under a relatively closed economy, you were just below the threshold that would make it worthwhile to export. Then you see that your export tariffs decline. Then you say, okay, now it's worthwhile to invest in modern technology, to upgrade and start exporting. For firms that are at the very low end of the productivity distribution, that might still be no hope, unless you have major changes in the way in which they're producing.
Two questions. One is, can you tell us a little bit more about the price? So as I understand in your methodology, the key thing is to see what happens to prices. Right? If one just assumes that markets remain the same, so that one doesn't have to do that extra work that you did, then what really is driving everything is that the prices are falling. And so what these prices are, where do you have this price data? Is it the prices that firms are charging on export markets? Is it also the prices that they're charging on domestic consumers? That's one question. And the other one is, you talk about efficiency gains, but then you say that that's happening as firms are investing more. And then it just sounds like, well, they invest more and they lower costs, but that would not necessarily be higher TFP, just the returns from higher investment. So I wonder if you can clarify on that.
Okay, so on the first point, these data are product-specific unit values. So for this Chilean data set, there's this unique feature that each firm or each plant reports each product that it produces and also the units that it produces. So you can compute unit values, which are essentially product prices, right? For export, so for most of the time periods, we only observe the package, so overall sales, including exports, and we calculate prices for these. For a subset of years, we actually observe separate prices for the export market and the domestic market. And if we look at this subsum, which is relatively small, but what we see is that the decline in prices is particularly steep for the exported fraction of the good. There's also some decline in prices domestically, which suggests as you become more efficient, you pass on some of these gains also to domestic customers, which makes sense if you have an overflow demand curve. But this effect is particularly steep in the export market. And then the second question was,
so efficiency gains with capital investment. So you were explaining the observation that efficiency is falling, but then saying it's coming from investment that firms are making. So if it's investments, then it's not really PFP. I'm asking.
Okay, so in the frame of this becomes quite technical now, but if it's really just investment, it would go into the capital stock, and then you would take this into account when you compute markups, or also when you compute revenue productivity as an alternative. So it should not affect our results. But this is getting quite technical, so we should talk about.
I interpret the question differently, which is this when you say there are efficiency gains, is it a TFP gain or is it just a return to investment that the firms are making?
It's a TFP gain. So we have a small framework at the beginning of the paper, which is mathematical, where I show you under which exact conditions changes in marginal cost will map one-to-one into changes in true efficiency. And the assumptions that you need is constant returns, which we show hold in the data, no changes in input prices, which we also show holds in the data. So under these assumptions, you can use marginal costs as a proxy for efficiency. Yeah, but I'm happy to chat about this now.
Okay, Minister, and then Rolf, and then Judith.
I have a question. You can liberalize trade through tariff reduction or removal of non-tariff barriers. Do you think both achieve the same effects on farm efficiency?
So in principle, as long as the effect of the policy is to provide easier access to export markets for firms, I wouldn't have a prior that either of them is favorable. But there might be other people in the audience who have stronger priors on this.
So I'm not sure we want to go down that road. Often people think non-tariff barriers are more distortionary than tariffs, than ad valorem tariffs, but again, that's hard to generalize. Yes, Rob?
Mine is a little bit more of a technical question. If I understand correctly, the methodology rests on sort of linking the average cost to the marginal cost and then with the pricing equation. But we know that access to trade also changes the financial access of the firms there. For instance, firms get a lot of finance from even foreign buyers in form of payment. There are issues of access to working capital financing that correct. Now, in a world in which access to finance matter, that link between pricing and cost and the link between marginal and average cost kind of breaks down from, it's not any longer the one that we write in the C11. So I was wondering whether you had thought about that and how that sort of would change the methodology.
So why would the link break? So you mean access to financing in the sense of having access to investment in your capital stock. So the way in which we think about this is you invest in capital, which shows up in your production function, but it's also a more efficient capital, modern equipment. And then this will affect your efficiency. So in this sense, access to financing is a necessary condition for you to
one issue is the capital cost. The other one, I think, is really the working capital. So the question is whether, can you use enough material up to the point in which your marginal cost sort of is equalized to your marginal revenues or not. And if the firm is financially constrained, then they can't. That's the definition, I guess, of financial constraint. So what could happen as well is that the access to sort of trade changes the ability of firms to essentially get the pricing equation right. So I was just wondering whether there is
so again, we should talk about this in more detail. I'm not sure if it introduces any bias in the pricing. It might change the way in which we interpret results or the background under which these results will hold. But I don't see why it would change the main conclusion.
Jim,
yeah, just a side comment for Minister Ganimbo. When we had the first Chilean experience in 1980, we went also, in addition to looking at the census data, we went and did quite a few firm interviews with Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, which were published in a World Bank book in the early 1980s. The big concern was when you do a major tariff reduction, what is going to happen to the firms that survive and don't survive? So we mostly interviewed surviving firms. But what we found was there was very little investment going on because there was a lot of uncertainty. But mostly the firms that survived reduced the number of products that they were making. One example is often cited was instead of making 5 refrigerators, we do only 1. We imported the blueprint and we became efficient. So there was a lot of within plant efficiency gain, which was not captured, of course, by the average productivity measure that you're mentioning. So I think that there's a case for some of these reductions in tariffs leading to substantial reallocation within firms without having to invest or without investing.
So one quick response to this, we actually do calculate these marginal costs at the product level. Okay? So if you have multi-product plants, we can look at do these gains also show up for other products that you're producing, and we don't find evidence for this. So it looks really as if these gains are specific to the product that you're exporting. So say you're producing tables and chairs, very specific chairs, and you're starting to export these chairs. You invest in better technology to produce these, but it looks as if you're not becoming more productive at the same time in your table production. On average, right? I mean, of course, there might be firms.
Okay, so I will respond to Mr.'s question that whether policymakers should focus on tariff reduction or reduction of non-tariff barriers.
So there is one project launched by UNCTAD, which is to study of non-tariff barriers for working on that. So we have collected data on non-tariff barriers on many countries, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duty, product standards, and all sort of non-tariff barriers. And based on that, we got on the coverage ratio and how many products each country are affected and how many firms are affected. The initial studies show that the effect of non-tariff is much, much higher than that of tariffs. And only issue is that they are non-transparent, firms don't know it. Customs is one of the non-tariff barriers. As a study, please pointed out, there are barriers at the bottom level that discriminate between the firms. Product standards, quotas, tariff rate quotas, there are all sort of issues. And if policymakers focus on that, the gains in terms of productivity are much, much higher than the gain which we had from tariffs.
Okay, quickly, one more.
Yes, you mentioned that firms are encouraged by policy to make investments, do investment in R&D. I was keen to know how this is done. But secondly, the exporting, the P you observe, do you find that cases where P in domestic market is higher than P in the export market, such that actually they are using export market to tap economies of scale and actually sell slightly above the marginal cost, but below the average cost, as a way of surviving. Actually, overall, it increases the level of profits, even if the P for the market is lower than the P in the domestic market.
Yeah, I don't have this slide here, but so we have, as I mentioned this to Andres briefly, so we have a subset of years for which we observe the price that firms charge in the foreign markets, free on board, and the price charged in domestic markets. And there we see that there's a particularly strong decline in prices charged in the international market for export entrants, and there's a smaller decline in prices charged domestically. So it looks as if there's less pass-through of efficiency gains to domestic customers. Or speaking economically, there's probably a higher elasticity of demand in international markets. It's more competitive, so these export entrants have to pass on most of their efficiency gains in the form of lower prices in the international market.
But in levels, the export prices are higher.
That I'd have to check. Yeah, because we look within plants, so this is all in the fixed effects, right? Yeah, I'd have to check that.
Incentives to invest. Anything on the incentives to invest so that they can be more efficient in the future?
So yeah, this is actually a very interesting point. So you could say, well, why should I even invest in new technology if I anticipate that I'm going to pass on all these efficiency gains to customers in the form of lower prices, right? But what happens in the background is that essentially you don't raise your markups, but you sell much more. So we observe that quantity rises substantially, and total revenues also increase. So despite the fact that prices fall after export entry, total revenues increase because the increase in quantity is larger than the drop in prices. Okay, so for firms, it's still profitable to invest in this new technology, if this is the right way to.
You have to trust that firms know what's good for them.
And for the country as a whole?
For the country overall, yeah, you have, one thing is though that much of these gains are actually passed on to international customers.
Yes.
But what we also see is that there's some evidence that after 2-3 years, so as these exporters become more established, they raise their markups slowly. And then they would reap more benefits that stay within the country itself. And also if you look at existing exporters that just become larger, they already raise markups. So there more of the gains stay in the country right away. But not
sorry,
really.
I have to cut off and have to let
Thank you.
Chris Woodruff from Warwick University.
Okay, so while this is getting going, let me say a few sort of introductory. First of all, thanks to Eric and Andres for including this presentation in the program. They've done a brilliant job of sequencing things because we're going to dig just sort of deeper and deeper into the sort of efficiency and and exporter-buyer effects with this paper. This is joint work with Rocco, and it's not a paper yet, so by the time it's a paper, it may have other co-authors as well. But this is sort of very still preliminary work looking at some data that we've been collecting from the garment factories. This will all be data from Bangladesh. We're also now collecting data from Pakistan and beginning to do some work in Myanmar and other IGC countries as well. It's very much an IGC project. I don't think neither of us would be working on this if it weren't for the connections that IGC initially made for us in Bangladesh. And the last thing I want to say is the data have all been put together by Roy Creedon, who's here as well, and who does a remarkable job with what are very complex, very detailed, enormous quantities of data. So let me see if I can tell you. So I'm going to sort of skip all this because it's all been set up by the first few talks. But we're interested in kind of how does trade affect productivity in these among these garment firms. These are all large exporters. So we're starting with a sample that are firms that are exporting, and they're almost all domestically owned. So I think one of the things that makes this sector interesting to us and somewhat unique is, and in fact I've got a slide in the other presentation I'll do tomorrow that I should have put in here as well from our white paper from the group that shows the distribution of firm sizes across a lot of the IGC countries. And Bangladesh stands out in having a very large number of very large firms among all of the low-income countries. And those are almost all garment manufacturers. There are about 5,000 large firms in the garment industry. The data, which are internal records to the firm, so it's going to be sub-firm level data, production line data, which I'll explain in a minute, allow a very detailed measure of productivity, which is going to be a quantity-based measure of productivity. It comes from a large number of factories and is comparable across factories. Comparable across factories. So we're going to use the data to demonstrate first that there's a lot of heterogeneity within plants as well as across plants, and then we're going to ask, does the identity of the buyer, because for at least a subset of the factories that in the first project that we did, and almost all the factories in the second project that we've done, we know on a given day, on a given production line, who is the buyer for the product that's being produced. So it does the identity of the buyer, and in particular the quality of the buyer measured by average unit values controlling for a lot of different, basically controlling for quantities and products. Does that affect, or does that affect productivity, and does it explain at least part of the dispersion in the data? So dispersion of productivity across plants has been is sort of one of the organizing themes of the firm's group at IGC. It's been subject to a lot of discussion. There's an interesting paper from 25 years ago now looking at the efficiency of kitchens in Marriott hotels in the U.S. So it's within the same organization and seeing how efficient. And what we're doing is very much in line with what these guys did, with Marriott kitchens. So the data are going to be from internal records of ready-made garment firms in Bangladesh. We've collected them in the context of projects on management training. We have a project on training female sewing machine operators to be supervisors, which involves about 80 factories. Most of what I'll show you is data from that project, from the first 60 factories in that project. And then we have a second project training existing supervisors, from which we have much higher quality data, higher quality in the sense that it's continuous for a period of a year, daily line level data for a period of a year. There are 26 factories in that project. We probably have high quality data for about 20 of them. Right now we have data for 7 of those that we've processed and made comparable across plants and across factories, and that's what I'll use. So it's production line level data, and so one question is, so why do we think these data are particularly interesting to address these questions? Well, this is again, Nico sort of already went through this. Most of the time we look at productivity, we have revenue productivity measures, not quantity measures. Or we have quantity with very homogeneous goods. And this is going to allow us to get multi-product firms, but allow us to get quantity measures of, at least for the sewing part of the operation of these products. And the key is what's referred to as a standard minute value or a standard allowable minute, and how long it takes to make a given stitch. And I'll say something more about that in just a minute. Then we're going to match these data from the internal records of the firms with transaction level customs data that we have from Bangladesh from the period 2005 to 2012. In theory, the factories in the sample could be matched to customs data. In practice, it's a lot more difficult than that. A lot of the factories are parts of groups. The product in one factory may be exported through a different factory and so forth. So it's difficult to match the factories, but we can match the buyers. So we know who the identity of the buyers, the given products are. We can go to the customs records and find average unit prices, quality measures of those buyers for the line level being produced. So schematically, it's basically, this is the idea. We've got the NBR Customs Management Bureau and customs data, which is transaction level, including the identity of the seller and also of the buyer. We have factored the line level production data. I'll give you more detail on that soon, which includes the identity of the buyers for at least a subset of the factories. We're going to come up with measures of line level productivity, measures of quality of the buyer, and we're going to bring those two together to ask, does the identity of the buyer affect the efficiency of the production on the line on a given day? So this is an organizational schematic of a generic garment factory, not one of ours, but it's to point out really that we're going to focus on the sewing section. It's one piece of a very large organization. It's a bit more than half the employment. So it's a big part of the labor part of the factory, even if it's not a big part of the factory itself. This is how in the woven sector at least, which is all in woven and light knit sector, where our factories come from. This is how a typical organization of production, with a production line that you can see going down either side here, supervisors that are walking the line, and then sewers as they go along. You can think of this as inputs coming in this end of the line and the product coming out the other end of the line. In fact, the inputs went through several points on the line, but basically there's a sequential process as you move down the line. The factories that we're going to look at are quite large. I think the only thing I want to really take away from this slide is, on average, they have about 19 production lines in the factory, about 2,000 employees, a little more than half of which are involved in sewing. They're well established, and as I say, they export everything, essentially everything that they produce. So the key to this, and I think the thing that one of the pieces that we found interesting about this and about the sector is the ability to measure productivity in a quantity sense across factories and even across countries. And the key is that if I take a garment and give it to an industrial engineer, the industrial engineer will look at each stitch on the garment and will tell me what machine is needed to produce to do that stitch, and how long the stitch should take, how many seconds it should take somebody operating at full efficiency to produce that stitch. They'll come up with what they call an operation breakdown, which will show each step of the process of making the garment and the number of seconds, so this is actually a number of minutes, that it should take to do that step at full efficiency. So we have these measures, these SMV measures for at the product level across the factories. They allow us to say if it should take 4.5 minutes, and we see in the data that it actually takes 9 minutes, then the firm's operating at 50% efficiency, and that's going to be the idea, that we'll have output quantities of the individual products. We're going to end up with output minutes, which will be a comparable measure that we can use across factories to think about output. Yeah.
I was going to say, you're sort of underselling. It's not just you have Q, but you have like a Q adjusted for complexity of the product. which normally we don't have, right?
So, well, no, but I
much
think
better than anyone.
No, but I think so. I think what it is, but it's Q. It's a comp. Well, that's again. It's a comp. Maybe I just didn't explain it well. It's a comparable queue across products, right? So it's not that I've got 1,000 shirts. I've got a certain number of output minutes, which is how long the shirt should take to produce. So that's the queue measure.
Yeah, I'm just saying. So Nico has Q in his data set.
Yeah.
You were better than Nico basically because you have. I mean, whatever for these particular products because you.
I'd say maybe different, but
I like to.
No, so I think that's right. The one caveat I would say to that is if I think about the same shirt produced for Hugo Boss and produced for Primark, lower end British retailer, the quality expectations of the shirt may differ, and it could be we still have some sort of quality issue even in our queue. But I agree that I think that's what we like about this is that it allows us to get at a measure of quantity which is comparable across products and comparable across not only shirts in the same kind of product, but I can take a pair of pants or a blouse or anything else if I've got the SMV measure, the measure of how long it should take to produce this product. Then I can get a measure of the output minutes, which is the number of pieces, the Q we usually think of, times the standard minute value. That's a measure of output which is comparable across products. And again, I think that's what we do. And then efficiency is just that divided by the number of operators or the number of people working on the line, operators plus helpers, times the run time of the line. How long does the line operate on a given day? So we get these estimates of efficiency at the line level daily for each factory. In Bangladesh, typically people say that I should have. Teresa actually has a nice slide from Technopack, which shows has something that's along this level. Typically, the factories are about 40% efficient in Bangladesh. People say that the best of them are about 60% efficient. People say that Sri Lanka, which is sort of the case people hold up, is 70 or 80% efficient. So much higher. So this is what the data look like when they come to us. This is from a relatively good factory. What the data look like, usually in Excel format. So this is a single day's production on the floor and lines on 2 different units, 3 different units, and then the lines within units. And it tells us who the assistant production manager, the supervisor, the date, who the buyer is, what the style number is, and so forth, and the SMV for that product, and other information. And then also tells us the number of operators working from 8 to 5, from 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, and so forth. The legal workday in Sri Lanka, the normal workday in Bangladesh is 8 hours. They're allowed 2 hours of overtime. So they've got the 8-hour day, they've got the overtime hours, and then they have the extra overtime hours, which is the hours beyond what they're meant to be working. They calculate from that the output. They have the output minutes from the output in the SMV, and they have the total number of minutes available, which they calculate from the labor side, and they end up with an efficiency level. So it's daily efficiency at the production line level for the set of factories. So we can measure dispersion both across factories and within factories. We have some work to do yet to get a full data set on across factories, because these on the one hand there's an international standard for a standard allowable minute. I can look at a shirt. I can look in a book. It will tell me, given the fabric I'm using, the type of machine and so forth, how many seconds it should take. Actually, what factories typically do is do their own time and motion studies and figure out how long it should take at full efficiency to make a product.
Just a really quick clarifying question. The quality differences across buyers will show up as buyer differences, right?
They'll show up as I'll show you in a minute, but they'll show up as I'm gonna run regressions where I put efficiency on the left-hand side and the identity of the buyer, or a variable which measures the quality of the buyer on the right-hand side, and I'm gonna look for the coefficient on the buyer and see whether the efficiency is higher when I've got a higher end buyer. So that's going to be the exercise that we'll do. So what we're in the process of doing is trying to match products across factories. So we have a sample that from where we have an overlap in who the suppliers are. We can identify a supplier, say H&M, who's sourcing the exact same product from multiple factories, and we're able to match. We'll be able to match those products across factories, and also individual processes across factories. So in any kind of collared shirt, I'm going to have an attachment, a step that attaches the collar. We'll be able to match the collar attached step across.
So is the efficiency in which these firms use raw materials that's comparable?
So not necessarily, and as I say, I think we're only focused on the sewing operation. The firms will have what they call a cut-to-ship ratio, which is the ratio of the fabric they get in and the fabric that goes out in the form of products. That also varies across factories. That's also quite important in terms of the efficiency, the overall efficiency of the factory. We're not going to say anything about that. We're going to focus on the sewing operation. So in that sense, as I said, we're only focused on one part of the production process. It's the part of the production process which is most labor intensive, and in that sense, I think it's the part that interests us the most. But it's fair to say it's only one part of the production process, not the overall efficiency of the factory.
Efficiency of the machines.
I'm going to get to that. We do have some data on that. It turns out factories don't keep very good records. They know how many machines they have of different types, and how many are automatic cutting machines, and how many are manual cutting, manual machines. For example, which is one dimension along which affects efficiency quite a lot. They don't know where those machines are on a given day, and they don't track where they are.
Chinese and German machines are ready.
So we've got data on that. I don't think we're going to see any difference you may see difference in durability, and in the amount of time they're not functioning, they're out, maybe, but you're not going to see, and that's something we actually can look at, because we have lost production minutes from a lot of the factories on a daily basis. We could see if the ones that use different types of models of machines have different lost minutes. But in terms of the output itself, it's not going to, while the machine's operating, that's not going to make that much difference. So this we have a potential sample of 60 factories. In this analysis, I'm actually going to use two different data sets. They're going to show almost identical results, as it turns out. 10 minutes, okay. In this, we've got a sample of about 24 factories for which you have buyer data and efficiency data. The data at the line level, typically every other month, measures number of workers present, absent, so forth. We use a sample of about 35,000 day line observations from the 24 factories, and again, our measure of efficiency that I already talked about. So here's just a graph that says, look across the factories where we think we have comparable data. This is what dispersion and productivity at the line level looks like, the blue line. Even when we get control for factory fixed effects, we see quite substantial variation within factory across production lines. Now, we don't really have a benchmark for this yet, and we don't have, ultimately we'll do a correlation where we say, where we see factories with more dispersion within the factory, do we see lower average productivity? We haven't done that yet, but I will say it's a pretty big number, that if I look at a typical floor that has 10 production lines, the most efficient production line will be about 2/3 as efficient as the least efficient production line. I don't know how that compares to data from the U.S. or from other countries, but that's what the data look like for us. There's also, persistence in efficiency across lines. So this is from actually the second data where we have monthly data for the whole thing. We see there's quite a high correlation from one month to the next inefficiency on a given line level. It disappears, but then it reappears so that even 8, 9 months later, the efficiency on a production line is related to what it was. It's very highly correlated with what it was 8, 9 months earlier. On the other hand, some part of that may be explained by producing the same products and the buyer effects. We see a correlation in buyer quality for a couple of months. That disappears and goes to zero and doesn't come back. So in the long run, firms are mixing up it's not that certain lines are producing high products for high-end buyers and other lines are producing for low-end buyers. They're mixing that production up across lines more or less randomly. There's no correlation. There's no correlation at all. Okay, so is productivity related to buyer quality? We're going to get buyer quality out of something like this, which is taking the unit prices from the export data, total value divided by weight, and then running a regression controlling for HS, 4-digit HS code, and quantities, and the year and quantities across the data. That's going to give us a set of buyer fixed effects from about 1.2 million transactions over 8 years, and our measure of buyer quality is going to be the residual, the buyer fixed effect, basically, that comes out of this regression. So this is what it looks like for some selected buyers, and basically it looks pretty reasonable. At the high end, you have Polo, Lands' End, Esprit, and so forth. At the low end, you have Walmart, Sainsbury, Woolworths, and so forth. So this is what the unit values look like. This is the number of buyers active on a line in the data set. So again, it's to say these guys are, a given line isn't focused on a single buyer. This is the share of production on a given line to the maximum, to the most frequent buyer on that line. Again, it's generally the lines aren't specialized to a single buyer. This is by factory. It tells us there's quite a lot of variation in the data in this data set that we have. There's quite a lot of variation in across factories and who the buyers are. Let me skip that and get to basically to the results. So this is saying, look. So I think we're going to start with a regression where we say, let's just take the log buyer quality measure, put it on the right-hand side of a regression with this efficiency on the left-hand side without any fixed effects, and we get a coefficient which is 0.07. I'm not going to try to say anything about the magnitude of that. I'll come to magnitudes in just a second. But we get a coefficient of 0.07. Then we put in fixed effects at the factory level, and that coefficient drops to 0.04. So that says that some of this is coming from the fact that factories that work for higher-end buyers are more productive. We control for that. Then we put in line fixed effects. So now I'm asking, what happens to efficiency on a given production line when that line's working for a high-end buyer as opposed to a low-end buyer? And we find quite a strong positive effect, so that even on a given production line, when the production line is working for a higher-end buyer, we get a much stronger effect. This is an easier coefficient to interpret in that this is just taking the sample and saying, let me take the buyers that are above median and below median, and the ones that are above median, the efficiency level is about 6 percentage points higher. Average efficiency is 43%. So this is really quite a high number. Even when we have all the fixed effects in, it's 3.5% higher. So it's almost 10% more efficient when the line is producing for a high-end buyer.
But this must be because your what was it called SMV value, it already allows for more time to produce higher quality.
That's possible, but I actually don't think that's what's going on. The factories will say.
Otherwise, if you just took number of jackets as output without any correction, you would expect that for a higher value jacket to produce, you need more time. So the efficiency should go down.
So first of all, the factories don't say that's not the case. That the SMVs are different by buyer. What they do say, so we have an industrial engineer on as part of the project team. And when I showed him these results, when I showed him the results, he said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I would expect." And why would I expect that? He said, because when a line's producing for a high-end buyer, that's where the company makes its reputation, and that's where they put all of the effort. And so its management effort is part of what's explaining that difference. That people are focused on that. We see on this, we see lower quality effects. We see lower absenteeism on the lines when the lines are producing for higher end buyers.
So it might be that most of the difference is in the raw material, whereas the sewing itself is mostly the same.
So it's not what do you mean raw material? It's not going to be the fabric. I mean, again, this is efficiency in sewing only.
Yeah.
So it's got to be it's changing in efficiency in sewing. It's not the raw materials.
Right. So the goods might be higher priced just because the inputs are more expensive.
Right. So that's true. But this is efficiency in sewing. So we control for so as I said, the factories don't record what workers are working on which line on a day-to-day basis. Workers are assigned to a line. The administrator data will tell us where they're assigned, but on a given day they may be actually working somewhere else. They don't record the number of where the machines are on a given day. We've gone to each of these factories and on a given day done a census where we walk every line, record every operator, record every machine. We're able, so I'll limit the sample here to a window of 3 months around the time that we did that census, and I'll put in the percent senior operators and the percent automatic machines. These don't show up as significant, but more importantly, it really doesn't affect the magnitude of the effect of the buyers. So, we don't think that this is going to be explained by differences in machines. If I look across all the factories, it is the case that there's a positive correlation between the percentage of automatic machines and the average buyer that I sell to. But within factories, there's no correlation. So that's just saying, again, at a factory level, the factories that have more advanced equipment are selling to higher-end buyers, but within factory, they're not allocating production that way. Okay, so, and again, this is a different sample, but we get something that's quite a similar number, 6 percentage point above and below mean.
Did you measure, visits by high-end buyers by sending their own staff, controllers or mentors into the factory?
So we don't have that, but that again is something that our IE has that our staff IE has mentioned that happens when it's a high-end buyer. The buyer will have people there as the production's going on, and that's also part of it. So our question is, which is not clear yet, whether this is learning or not. Better machines or workers, again, and now we have a bit of data on that. We don't think it's better machines or workers. Managers say it's not the case. I didn't update the slide, but when we control for those, we don't see anything. Addition managerial attention is a possible explanation. Buyer attention is a possible explanation. A key question that we want to ask, and with the second project's data, where we have daily data across the full year, we'll be able to unpack a bit more, is to say, suppose I take a line that's producing for a low-end buyer, then for a window of time it produces for a high-end buyer, then it goes back to a low-end buyer. Do I see some residual effect of the higher productivity when the high-end buyer is there? Do I see the second shoulder being slightly higher, somewhat higher than the first shoulder? So that's something we haven't done yet, but we'll be able to do with the data where we have the data that's continuous across all of the factories. So that's sort of, I think there's a lot of work yet to do to unpack this, but again, this is all quite preliminary. So suggestions and ideas are welcome. We're also still collecting data on all these factors, so if there are things we need to be collecting, we can get even more information. Rory's laughing, but okay, so I'll stop there.
Actually, we have.
I'm thinking about the cause of all this, why this happens.
So are we.
One thing I can think of is that the suppliers are more careful about meeting their targets of time in very don't see what other incentives will be there for for them to be more efficient, because they can, in fact, give more prices so that they can be more, funds can be more relaxed.
So I think one incentive the firms have, I guess the way we think about this is one incentive the firms have is that, again, it's a reputational effect, that I want to move up the higher end buyers. How do I move up the higher end buyers? I show that I'm a really good supplier to this buyer. And meeting the deadlines and meeting the quality standards and sort of making sure that product is done right is maybe especially important to me if it's the highest end buyer that I work with them. I mean, one of the things we could do that I haven't done is we could look factory by factory and say, what's the relative ranking of this buyer within the factory, and do we see an additional effect if it's the highest end buyer in the factory, as opposed to just the level of buyer quality across buyers.
Yeah. So sorry, the secretary in front. Sorry, I'll get back to that. Go ahead. Yes.
Yes. Is there any? Have you studied this aspect that there is a correlation between level of literacy and productivity? Because in Sri Lanka it's 100% literacy, and in Pakistan this is one major cause of low productivity because science education is lacking even in those who are educated in class 10.
So we haven't, and we don't have, because the way production's organized, most of these factories don't record individual level output. We have only line level output. And even if they record individual level output, because it's a sequential production process, it's not clear what I make of that individual output. So we have, from survey samples, education levels and literacy tests of a sample of the workers on the lines. So the best we would be able to do would be to take that sample that we have, but the problem is we have a sample of 2 out of 40 workers, so it's not going to be it's going to be a very noisy indication of the literacy level on that line. So I think with the data we have, we don't really have a way of doing that, other than asking if the level of the operator, junior operator, senior operator, or how long it takes to get promoted. That's from the HR data we can see how that relates to the literacy measures that we have.
But how would you then be making recommendations for improvement in factories if you don't sort of correlate this?
Well, so I think we're in some of the projects that we're doing sort of specific training interventions, and I think it's for the training programs there typically is a literacy requirement, so we do a literacy test up front. For the other kinds of interventions, I think we'll get policy implications out of those interventions, but we don't. But it's. I mean, there's a limit in these data where we have line level data what we can say about the effect of the individual worker. And again, part of that comes if factories recorded the information, and we likely will try to find a subset of factories who are willing to do that over a period of time. If they recorded the information of where workers moved day to day, then we could back out individual productivity, the effect of individual workers, and we could get at questions like this. But factories at this point don't record that information, so there's a limit to what we can say about that.
Right. So the question I got is how much of what you're observing is just reallocation of high quality inputs or effort within the same firm to high-end buyers. So how much is just an increase of the productivity?
So that's a really good question. That's one we can answer, but I can't give you an answer right now. This one, the data will allow us to answer, I should say, but I don't have an answer for you right now. And the data will allow us to answer because we're going to have windows of time where we have the high-end buyers, where they're producing for the high-end buyers, and windows of time where they're not. And then we can look at the average efficiency of a middle-range buyer where production is happening in both those windows of time, and we can see if that goes down when they're producing for a higher-end buyer. I haven't done that, but that's a good idea. So that's one we can follow up on. Next year I'll give you an answer.
Okay. Ahmed, I guess one thing that I'm would still like to see is you show this big difference in dispersion productivity, and I'm not sure where that's coming from. And so you showed us one effect on buyers, but I'm wondering if that buyer effect is actually the biggest effect. And so that's just a simple decomposition.
So
presumably you've done that in focusing on this particular reason.
So we haven't done the decomposition yet because we've just gotten the data that allow us to look at the census. A big piece of it is going to be the quality of the operators and the quality of the machines. And so we've just gotten the data that allows us to match that up. So I haven't done that decomposition yet. But that's on the that's part of the idea. So I do want to say it looks like buyers may be a part of it.
Sure.
But we don't know how much of it yet because we haven't done the decomposition.
Okay. We're about running over. So Xavier and Minister, and then we'll stop.
I just want to remind you that I think in Mauritius investing in Madagascar in the 2000s, one of the major factors was the competence of the senior management, and also, and I don't know if it is the case for Bangladesh, those who were locally, domestically trained, and those who were imported from outside. And then you could use only the most kind of efficient in organizing the work in the factory, only imported because you could have a return on their cost as a kind of internationally paid type of person. So do you play a little bit on that?
So that's a good idea, and we don't, and that suggests some more data that we should be gathering. We collect information on some characteristics of senior management, of the very top management. We and I'm in control for those yet, but we can't. That's of course going to be across factories, not within factories. But a lot of these factories have Sri Lankans as production managers, assistant production managers, and we don't. I think we haven't asked that whether on the staff they have APM and above. How many foreign workers do they have?
They have very unique names too from Sri Lanka.
I see. So we could get them off the right. So we have the HR data. So we could get off the HR data. We could make it. We could see how many of the top management are foreign. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Karim gets the last word.
Yeah. From a policy-making perspective, how do you see the implications of the findings of the study?
Well, I'm not. So first of all, I would say I would be cautious to make any policy recommendations on based on what we've done so far because it's all very preliminary. But I would say that if we see these kind of results holding up and we see there really is a buyer effect, and especially if we're able to unpack and say it looks like it's learning that the working for higher end buyers actually gives you a residual effect that you're more efficient across time, then I would say, perhaps there's some role for trying to figure out how do you attract the higher end buyers and how do you get it, maybe it's information about which are the best producers that might make matching easier for the high-end buyers. It might make it easier for them to find the appropriate factories and so forth, or other things along those lines. But I do want to sort of I don't want to go there yet because I think we have work to do in terms of how we unpack some of these differences. Great, thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
It's okay. I'll send you the talk, the one. So I take out the last couple of slides, the backup slides, so that it's not super long. I guess.
Yeah, and also the relationship with the partner. I mean, sure, the person and just sometimes the relationship fails. And so one thing we find with the which kind of and apply that the land because the success of it is maybe very we know for evidence of our export transaction was which is fine. Then it's market we
with the red from the central bank. So we can really look at the access and all the not just correctly, but from the domestic bank. And then of course it expands a lot.
Also the definition of
France where it's a little bit commercial, we don't know it's less than and that was a huge deficit by accessing what is called now
No, that's actually dangerous. I think this is why but the big thing is from the beginning. As soon as you use this from Brazil, the moment immediately they have the bank whatever financial sector, yes, trusted the because the paper was in central and maybe Bangladesh sometimes
and now it's all about I would say